Who told you rest had to be earned? This is a story today. It seems as though almost every day or every other day, something crops up in my mind that is related to something I do or have done or something, and I need to write it down into a story. So this is today's contribution to that. Made into a Rowan Files story from Whispering from the Rowan Tree. Have you ever been sitting peacefully when someone comes into the room and without even thinking, you start explaining yourself? I've already done the washing. I've been busy all morning. I was just about to get up. Nobody accused you of anything, but somehow you've already begun your defense. Perhaps you can't relax while someone else is working. Perhaps being needed feels strangely safer than being free. Or perhaps, like so many of us, you learned a long time ago that being useful was part of being good. Today in Aldervale, Nell Rowan has noticed something very peculiar. People all over the village appear to be presenting evidence for a crime nobody has accused them of committing. That crime, apparently, is doing nothing. Nell has one question. Who told you that rest had to be earned? So here is the story. There was a peculiar little mystery unfolding in Aldervale. No one had reported it. No one had even noticed it. And yet, Nell Rowan had begun seeing evidence of it everywhere. It happened in kitchens, gardens, sheds, sitting rooms. It even happened in the bakery one Wednesday morning when Betty Foster was discovered drinking coffee at a table by the window. I've already done the washing, Betty announced. Nell hadn't asked. Betty continued. And I've changed the bed. I've been to the chemist. Nell put down a shopping bag and said, Betty, I only just said, good morning. Betty stared at her and then she began laughing. I haven't a clue why I told you all that. Neither did Nell. But she intended to find out, because Betty wasn't the only one. There were people all over Aldervale apparently presenting evidence for a crime that no one had accused them ever of committing. And that crime appeared to be sitting down, doing nothing. Nell began listening. I've only just sat down. I was just about to get up. I've been busy all morning. Thought I'd just have 5 minutes. I've done everything I needed to do. The words varied, but the defence remained remarkably similar. One afternoon, Nell found Margaret Finch in her conservatory with a book. Margaret saw her coming up the path, and by the time Nell had reached the door, the book had disappeared beneath the cushion and Margaret was carrying a basket of laundry. Nell looked at the basket and then at Margaret and at the suspicious corner of a paperback sticking out beneath the cushion. Margaret surrendered immediately. All right. I was reading. Nell smiled. I know. Margaret began explaining that she'd been about to put that laundry away. Nell didn't believe a word of it. Apparently, being caught reading at 3 p.m. had turned into an or into a thing, an otherwise respectable woman, it turned her into a very poor criminal. They made some tea, and once they were sitting down, Nell asked Margaret why she had jumped up the minute she had seen her coming. Of course, Margaret didn't know. At first she thought it was simply a habit. Then she remembered her mother. Idle, that was one of her mother's words. Don't sit there idling, make yourself useful. There was always something that could be done, and if Margaret had been sitting for 10 minutes, her mum could somehow make it sound as though she'd been horizontal since Easter. Nell smiled, but something about it stayed with her, because a word doesn't have to be shouted to remain with us. Sometimes it only has to be repeated. Sometimes or continually. Idle, lazy, good for nothing. You're slopping around. You've been sitting there all day doing nothing. Make yourself useful. Ordinary sentences. But words don't only communicate, sometimes they install beliefs. Years later, the person who first spoke them might be long gone, but the sentence carries on perfectly well without them. That was when Nell began a new Rowan file. On the first page she wrote, "Who are you explaining yourself to?" She didn't have an answer. Not yet. Then there was Jenny. Jenny was one of those people everybody described as capable. If something broke, she usually had a look at it before calling anybody. She could mend things, alter things, make things, grow things. She'd worked since she was young and had done so many different jobs over the years that she'd accumulated skills almost accidentally. Show her something once, and she'd usually fathom it out. She had raised a family, helped people through illnesses, looked after children, earned money, made homes, solved emergencies, and somehow through it all, Jenny had learned one lesson particularly well. Be useful. She didn't think of it as a lesson. She thought it was just simply who she was. The strange thing was that Jenny was perfectly happy for other people to rest. Her family could disappear for an afternoon, browse shops, visit friends, wander around the market, come home 8 hours later. And Jenny thought absolutely nothing of it. Good, she said. I hope you had a lovely time. But if Jenny went out for 3 hours, something happened on the journey home. She began making a list. I should sort out that washing. I should do something in the garden. I need to tidy that room. So by the time she walked through the door, leisure had apparently incurred a debt. And Jenny immediately began paying it back. Nell found that fascinating. Why on earth did freedom look perfectly respectable on everyone else, but not on Jenny? The answer wasn't retirement. Jenny had been doing this for most of her life. Years earlier, she could be sitting perfectly peacefully until she heard somebody arriving home. A car, the gate, footsteps. Up she'd get, kettle on. She moved something around. She wiped something. Something was just being made ready, and sometimes she didn't even know she was doing it. Her body heard somebody coming in and responded before thought had caught up. Get up, do something, look useful. Nobody needed to say a darn word. Eventually, nobody did anyway, but that voice had moved inside. That was the part that Nell found most interesting. Original authors of our scripts can disappear. But that character, you, can continue performing for another 50 years. Jenny's circumstances had changed many times. The houses changed, people changed, work had changed. But the rule travelled with her. All over the years, another layer had been added. Jenny had contributed substantially to the home she shared with family, money, work, childcare, practical help, and a lot of time. She had given far more than anyone could reasonably put on a balance sheet, yet somehow, inside the very place she had helped provide, Jenny could still feel as though her right to be there needed renewing. Not with money, with being useful. To keep helping, keep contributing, keep doing. Don't become a burden. Don't be caught doing nothing. It was as though usefulness was the rent she paid for belonging. That troubled Nell, because Jenny didn't consciously believe any of it. If Nell had said to her that she had a right to live peacefully in her own home, Jenny would have said, "Of course I bloody do," and meant it. But beliefs weren't always found in what we said. Sometimes they were hiding in what we automatically did. So when someone came into a room and Jenny began explaining that she'd done the washing, been out in the garden, and was just gonna do something else, until one day Nell stopped her. "Jenny, I didn't ask what you've done." Jenny went quiet. Nell asked her something else. "Why are you explaining yourself?" Jenny looked towards the window. "I don't know." That became the mystery. Not whether Jenny deserved to rest, that was obvious. The mystery was why she thought she didn't deserve it at all. Then Nell discovered the hotel. Every now and again, Jenny booked herself into a small hotel outside Aldervale. Nothing grand, just one night, a little room with a bed, a television, tea and coffee. She took something to eat, checked in, closed the door, and did absolutely bugger all. She loved it. Sometimes she watched television for hours. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she drank tea in bed. She might not leave the room until breakfast, and she felt no guilt whatsoever. At first, Nell assumed Jenny enjoyed getting away, and then she realised Jenny wasn't going anywhere. She was paying to stop. That was different. At home, Jenny could feel guilty occupying a chair. At the hotel, she could occupy an entire room without apology. Why? Because she'd paid for it. The room was hers until checkout. No one could possibly expect her to weed the hotel garden, and no one was coming through the door wondering what she'd been doing. There were no household noises upstairs, no unfinished jobs quietly suggesting they needed doing, and no need to explain why she was lying on the bed at 2 in the afternoon. She had bought the room, but what she'd really bought was permission. Nell thought that was one of the saddest and strangest things she'd heard in a long time. A woman could pay for a home and still feel she had to earn the right to rest inside it. But she could pay for one night in a room belonging to a stranger and immediately feel entitled to peace. What exactly was she paying for? Not the bed, not the tilly, not those little packets of coffee. She was paying for a place where her existence required no explanation. Nell added another question to the Rowan file. Why do some of us spend our lives presenting evidence for our right to occupy space? Sounded dramatic, but the more she looked, the more ordinary it became. It was in that woman who apologised for reading in the afternoon, the man who couldn't retire without immediately finding another job or jobs around the house, the grandmother who felt guilty because she wasn't available every single time someone needed help, the person who couldn't buy herself something unnecessary without trying to explain where the money had come from, and the person who couldn't say, "I don't want to today," without providing excuses. And sorry. Perhaps that was why illness could feel so strangely different. Jenny had noticed that too. Normally she found stopping almost impossible. But give her flu, an operation, an injury, something officially wrong with her, and suddenly she could lie down. No guilt, because illness provided evidence. A doctor had effectively signed a permission slip. You are allowed to stop now. The reason is perfectly acceptable. Nell wondered how many people had lived like that, going and going and going, and until eventually the body produced the only excuse that they were prepared to accept. And there was something else Jenny had been wondering about, gut instinct. People were always being told to trust it. And Jenny did have a powerful bodily response when something needed doing, or someone sounded irritated, something went wrong in the house, or a job hadn't been finished. Maybe another person began huffing and puffing and struggling with something. Immediately, Jenny felt it. A gut feeling. Go, help, fix it. Is it your responsibility? Oh gosh, somebody must have thought she'd done something wrong, or she'd let someone down. Her body could produce the alarm before she had even established what had happened. Jenny asked Nell, was that intuition? Nell thought for a moment. Sometimes. But sometimes, Nell explained, an alarm was just simply an alarm. The body is astonishing. It can recognise danger before the conscious mind catches up. It can also remember danger long after the circumstances have changed. Someone is unhappy. You might be blamed. Do something, make it better, be useful. Nell wondered whether an old survival response had probably become so familiar that Jenny called it instinct. That feeling was real, but it didn't necessarily mean danger was. The question probably was whether to just trust ourselves, and learning which part of ourselves was speaking. Intuition might whisper, something isn't right. But that old alarm tended to shout, quick, do something or somebody will think badly of you. Nell laughed when Nell put it that way. Oh, mine is definitely a shouter. And perhaps that's where change begins. Not by defeating the voice, not because you cover the walls with better sayings, and not by collecting enough wisdom to finally become a perfectly healed, normal human being, but just by recognising who was speaking. You know, Jenny had notebooks full of things she's collected over the years. Sentences, ideas, bits of wisdom, things she'd heard, things she'd read, things that stopped her in her tracks because they seemed to explain something she had never been able to put into words. Oh, I'm going to remember that, she thought. And she hoped she would remember them. But sometimes she'd find one months later and think, oh my gosh, that's wonderful. Why didn't I remember that? Why didn't I do it? Even self-understanding could quietly become another thing to do, another task, something to get right. Nell didn't think Jenny needed more instructions. In fact, she probably needed fewer. There was one little thing Jenny had kept about a bird landing on a branch. Did the bird trust the branch, or did it trust its own wings? Interesting. Now like that, but after everything she'd learned, she thought the question went deeper. Because if you've spent your life worrying whether the branch thinks you're useful enough to sit on it, that's another thought entirely, isn't it? You know, every answer creates another question. And if usefulness is the price of belonging, that bill never stops arriving. That was the piece that Nell had been missing. It wasn't really a mystery about rest. It was a mystery about worth. Somewhere along the way, usefulness had stopped being something Jenny gave. It was proof of who she was. And if she wasn't doing, fixing, helping, earning, caring, solving or providing, who the heck was she? And Nell finally understood why telling Jenny she'd earned the rest didn't solve anything. It sounded kind, but hidden inside it was that same old guilt rearing its ugly head. So one afternoon when Jenny was sat with Nell, while rain was moving quietly across Aldervale, there was nowhere particularly important to go. Nothing needed doing. Jenny sat with Nell and drank her tea. After a while, she looked towards the window and said, I ought to go home and sort a few things out. Nell asked whether they actually did need sorting. Jenny admitted, no, they didn't. No one was waiting for her. No one needed her. So Nell suggested, why don't you stay? And Jenny did. But after a while, that restless feeling came again, that familiar little surge. You better get up, you better do something. Jenny did notice it, but for once she didn't obey. She didn't argue with it, she just let it be there. And then she said something very quietly, you know, I seem to have spent most of my life trying to prove I'm worth having around. Nell didn't rush to answer her. Jenny looked down at her hands. Who the heck am I trying to prove it to anymore? And that was the answer to this Rowan file. Sometimes no one's watching. No one is keeping score. No one is waiting to catch us doing nothing. But we still jump up. Because eventually we become our own judge. The own person, or our own person, standing at the door asking, what have you done today? There comes a time when you have no one to answer to anymore. When Nell was at home that evening, she opened the file and read everything she'd written. Why are you explaining yourself? You don't have to justify why you're here. And then she added one final question. Who told you rest had to be earned? And she sat with it. That answer might have been a parent, a husband, a wife, a teacher, poverty, work, family, a whole generation, or nobody that we could clearly remember. It didn't really matter. The author could be gone. Our life is in our hand now. And Nell thought again about the bird. The branch had never asked the bird to justify landing there. The bird simply landed and rested. And when the branch moved, it trusted its wings. So with that, Nell closed the Rowan file. You have the right to be just you, with no explanation from this point on. So there. Before we leave Aldervale, stay just for another moment. You don't have to do anything with this. There's nothing to learn, nothing to fix, nothing to achieve. Just imagine you're somewhere where you can be completely still. Maybe beneath that rowan tree, or you're in your favourite chair. Perhaps you're lying on a bed beside an open window. Or perhaps you're in a ridiculously overpriced hotel room with a tiny kettle and 6 packets of coffee. Wherever you are, nobody is asking what you've done today. Nobody is keeping score. Nobody needs proof that you have contributed. And if that familiar little feeling arrives, that little gremlin, go on, get up, do something. You just notice it because it's an old alarm, an old story. You don't have to fight it. You don't have to obey it. Feel whatever's supporting you. The chair beneath you, the bed, the earth, and let it hold your weight with no explanation. Now imagine setting down everything that you have carried. The work, the money, the caring, the fixing, the helping, the years of being dependable. Those things matter, of course they do, but they are not your admission ticket to the world. Your breath arrives without being earned. The ground holds you without asking for references. And for this one small moment, allow yourself to occupy your own life. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. That old voice may still speak. Let it. You are here. Nothing is required of you, and that is enough. Perhaps this week you'll catch yourself doing it, explaining why you're sitting down, listing the things you've already accomplished, feeling guilty because someone else is busy, getting up because you heard someone coming. And if you do, you don't have to change everything immediately, just notice. And perhaps ask yourself Nell's question: who am I explaining myself to? And as you might have gathered, this is something that I beat myself up with all the time. Just not being able to sit down without making excuses, defending myself, na. So, thank you for spending this time with me in Aldervale. I hope that this might help you somewhat, or give you information for someone you may know in this, or who does this. And this is Whispering from the Rowan Tree, and yet another Rowan file has been closed. It's closed, but not forgotten. So, whenever you need to be reminded, as I will, I will reread this, and hopefully you will listen to this again. So, bye for now. I will be back when something else rings my bell.